Two leaders, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here. At the end of the 20th century, there was an assumption that greater economic interdependence amongst countries would ensure peace and stability well into the new century. The global economic and political context today suggests that assumption was incorrect. Geostrategic tensions have re-emerged on multiple fronts with wide-ranging political, economic, and social consequences. For many countries, this tension is resulting in policy implementation which focuses on protecting short-term national interests while limiting broader obligations. In the context of sustainable development and inclusive growth, such policies are often fragmented, biased, or uninformed. A collective effort is required by the global community, particularly governments, civil society, and the private sector, to ensure that we work together to put long-term collective development ahead of short-termism. However, while this group holds the keys to ensuring we achieve the sustainable development goals, their interconnectedness also exposes the SDGs to an increasingly complex risk landscape. In this context, there are two broad challenges for leaders across the public and private sector that I will aim to cover today. First, are we properly appreciating the new risk environment? What are the emerging threats that might surprise us and hinder our ability to support sustainable development for all? Second, what does resilience for these risks look like? And how can we sensibly prepare our organizations to achieve it? Let's start with some good news. Across markets, the global economy is growing, and it seems we are leaving the specter of the global financial crisis behind. The IMF has revised the global growth figures upward from 3.7 to 3.9% for 2018-19. Business confidence is strong in many countries. Asia continues to be the global growth engine, with emerging and developing Asia expected to grow at around 6.5% for 2018-2019. Roughly the same as 2017. The region continues to account for over half of global growth. As Christine Lagarde has remarked in Davos, this is also a good time for government to repair the roof while the sun is shining and address any structural weaknesses in their economies. But looking beyond the good news, I think it's important we always remind ourselves that the context of global recovery and growth has been and will continue to change at an extraordinary pace. It's this pace of change that is shaping the global risk environment. Not only are there fast forces of change connecting and intersecting in increasingly unexpected ways with complex reverberations, they have raised questions about the overstretching of existing norms and the possibility in some areas of runway collapse or the transition to a new suboptimal status quo. Consider, for example, how social media as a technology has brought us closer together by negating physical distance, while at the same time driving a wedge in communities by creating echo chambers, exacerbating social polarization. Organizations have realized that we are facing fundamentally a new risk environment characterized by emerging and interconnecting threats rather than well-known standalone ones. This graph describes the global risk landscape in terms of likelihood and impact. As evaluated by nearly 1,000 risk experts in the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risk Perception Survey, a couple of observations here. Environmental threats retain their paramount position in the minds of risk experts, with extreme weather and natural catastrophes topping the chart in likelihood as well as scoring high in impact. 2017 saw a rise in the importance of cyber threats, and they are definitely here to stay. There is a clear cluster of high and medium likelihood and impact geopolitical and societal risks. Weapons of mass destruction has moved up significantly in likelihood and quite obviously out of concerns linked to North Korea. Let's focus on the top right-hand corner where environmental risks dominate. As you can see, extreme weather and natural catastrophes occupy the top of the chart. What is also notable is the presence of climate change response failure. This risk was significantly amplified during 2017 with the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Accord. I'd also like to highlight the two red dots that are among the top risks in terms of likelihood and impact. Through these risks, we can draw a clear link between environmental risk and pertinent societal risks. Firstly, Asia is expected to be firmly within the crosshairs of water crises of the future, with 88% of the region's population impacted by water shortages by 2050. The crisis can be argued to originate from a combination of climate change, extreme weather events, and poor urban planning. We also think about what has been termed climate refugees, people that are displaced by extreme events which rob them of their livelihood and force them to uproot and move to other areas. For governments, but also businesses and other organizations, the priority right now for environmental concerns is focused on three major areas: natural catastrophe management. The assessment of vulnerability to extreme weather events is particularly important due to the large human and economic costs that these events entail. Pollution reduction. This is a priority for government not only in China, where this problem has been very serious, but also for other governments in the region. Low carbon transition. Tying to the previous points, we are seeing a momentous shift to a low carbon economy. Again, China has been the leader in the region in promoting renewable energy, which has become a priority for many countries. Renewable infrastructure projects are being developed across the region and are receiving ample support from government initiatives. There is also a shift in investment sentiment towards low-carbon assets, and there has been a substantial rise in green finance instruments such as green bonds. Let's talk about cyber next. Again, there are three observations here. The loss from cyber attacks and cyber breaches is substantial. The cost of cybercrime to businesses may amount to $8 trillion over the next 5 years. This trend is perhaps inevitable as the number of interconnected devices in the world is expected to double between now and 2020, thereby increasing the access points for malware. But marked escalation in large cyber attacks is worrying. To put things into context, Lloyd's have calculated that the takedown of a single cloud provider could cause as much economic loss as Hurricane Katrina. Enormous industrial transformations have resulted in market disruptions and subsequent shifts in market power. Consider, for example, the concentration and social risks arising from the growing power of the biggest tech companies. The largest technology giants are between them spending $50 billion a year in R&D, commandeering a lot of specialist AI talent, amassing colossal amounts of data, and making radical plays in sectors from automotive to healthcare to financial services. A new political dynamic. Technological prowess is seen by both superpowers as a means of future competitive advantage in terms of both economic supremacy and national security. This has led to two things. First, high levels of concern about foreign providers of technology and critical infrastructure. Secondly, increased geopolitical tensions as a result of purported instances of state-sponsored, ever more sophisticated cyber attacks. The point on geotechnological concerns gives us a nice segue into talking about the increasing complex geopolitical relations in the region. Globally, major democracies have been hit with waves of populist, nationalist pressures. We can think about the US 2006 election, Brexit, the Catalonia crisis in Spain, and the Philippines, if we were to think closer to home. More intense identity politics and greater attempts by political leaders to consolidate executive power may increase the likelihood of backlashes by populations disappointed in the ability of governments to deliver promised benefits. Second, the world's largest powers appear to be on maneuvers. The US shifting objectives and style, Russia regaining ground in former areas of influence, and China intensifying strategic goals. The resultant vacuums and collisions are both stirring the larger regional powers to a bolder action and also arousing the concern of smaller states who fear that they may be squeezed by the moving of these tectonic plates and have fewer opportunities to pivot and hedge than not so long ago. Third, the geopolitical threat landscape is multifaceted. At one end of the spectrum, we have a real risk of deployment of nuclear weapons. I believe here in Korea this is acutely felt. At the other, a raft of economic protectionist measures being implemented in a largely ad hoc fashion, and in between, proxy conflicts in third-party states, cyber engagements, propaganda and disinformation ventures, what we call piloted chaos in one nice turn of phrase. Finally, let's turn to the positive global economic growth story again. The headline numbers have often masked underlying fragilities. In the current global landscape, let me talk about 4 worrying trends. First, the influence of politics and protectionism. The rise in net harmful trade actions by G20 countries is an easy indicator, but probably the less interesting part of the story. More interesting is the less well aggregated volume of corporate bailouts and state subsidies, investment constraints, and workforce migration restrictions, and buy local imperatives. Also of note here are the fraught attempts to renegotiate major trade agreements. Second, debt. Global debt has risen to a record $233 trillion, more than 3 times global annual economic output, with the growth of debt in China in recent years a particular concern. Persistently low commodity prices continue to challenge the fiscal situation of key exporter countries. Third, high asset prices. Markets have continued to rise over the last year, after a bit of a bump just now. According to one cyclically adjusted price earnings index, stocks have only twice before been as high as they are now. In 1929, not a good year, and 2000. The World Bank has recently warned about the possible consequences of sharply higher interest rates that could be triggered by better than expected growth. And fourth, inequality and financial insecurity. Stock markets may have risen, and the global economy may be growing, but real wages have not grown for many, and fears of long-term financial insecurity are growing. These concerns, allied with the sense that the wealthy are getting wealthier, continue to fuel political discontent and link back to the populism mentioned earlier. Let me expand on the last point on rising inequality. I think it's an important theme to illustrate the risk landscape facing us. On the screen, we have the 5 global trends that risk experts agree will strongly inform global development over the next 10 years. I think this is a good case to illustrate how the risks I have explicated in the previous slides can be tied together in this particular instance. In 2016, rising income and wealth inequality has been the main driver in upsetting domestic social stability, geopolitical relations, and international cooperation. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the United States election. Inequality has proceeded to exacerbate the polarization of societies and pave the way for increasingly inward-looking economic policies. But this rising inequality has found its sources in other trends as well. Automation, for instance, has taken away many low-income jobs, which are poor people's livelihood in Asian countries. The International Labour Organization has estimated that millions of jobs will be lost in manufacturing in Asia as a result of intensifying automation in the region. Aging population is another trend that has exacerbated inequality. The increased burden on pension systems has meant that the oldest and the weakest will be hit the hardest. Finally, extreme weather events will also disproportionately displace the poorest, creating potential economic and social crises, such as in the form of forced migration. What I'm trying to drive home is the interconnectedness of different risks and risk trends that I have alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. We are facing a new risk ecosystem that poses a great challenge to achieving sustainable development. The World Economic Forum also conducts an annual survey with the business executives and asks them to rank the top concerns for doing business in their own country over the next 10 years. And here you see the top risk category selected per country in Asia Pacific. It's clear that the highest priority specific risk concerns vary significantly across the region, reflecting socioeconomic diversity, varied national interests, and recent events in each country. Given the topics already covered, I will pick out only a few stories here. The risk of natural catastrophes continues to be a high-profile threat, This is especially true for countries such as China, which are more prone to and have historically suffered great human and economic damages from these events. High unemployment is the #1 risk on average across the region, and is also the top risk identified by business executives in South Korea. Wider economic concerns such as asset bubbles and energy price shock have always ranked highly in the region and continue to do so. Particularly concerns over a hard landing in China continue to be front of mind for many organizations as China transitions from an investment-led to a consumption-led growth model. The great challenge for SDGs is that their achievement is dependent on the workings of a complex ecosystem across government, the private sector, and civil society. At Marsh & McLennan Companies, we believe there are 2 areas of risk management which all organizations, be they public or private, can benefit from focusing on in this evolving risk environment to ensure ongoing resilience to emerging threats. The first involves shifting the balance of effort from familiar risks to emerging threats and complex strategic uncertainties. Restless curiosity is essential, as is the energization of risk identification processes to capture and characterize those real destroyers of value. In doing so, examine key trends and dependencies for the organization that amplify any potential impacts, and consider the human dimension as a risk amplifier, by which I mean both the scope for reputational issues to blow out of control and also the damage that could be caused by rogue insiders and increasingly rogue outsiders in this more sophisticated, more charged political climate. The second shift is from prevention to response. Protection in a barrier sense against some of the possible shocks is usually unfeasible or too costly. So contingency planning and testing based on a range of scenarios is critical, as is strategic agility. In a political and business landscape that is in some flux, organizations that have that versatility may be in a stronger position to thrive. And finally, my point is about stewardship. Perhaps more than ever, leaders from the public and private sector need to both hold bold strategic ambitions and organizational resilience in their heads at the same time to position themselves most effectively for the future. The Global Risk Report makes for somber reading every year. It's just simply the nature of the content. When correctly channeled, however, the report should ensure that we all maintain a healthy unease about the potential for global risks to hinder sustainable development. In turn, we must not become complacent, and we must not be tempted into looking after individual interests rather than the collective good. Technological advancement continues at an astounding rate, and if we channel our progress correctly and pool our respective capabilities, then we can ensure that we realize the goals of sustainable development for all. It's been an honor to represent Marsh & McLennan at this inaugural Global Engagement and Empowerment Forum on Sustainable Development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Moczarski, for your excellent presentation, but also keeping your time. Because we have a huge challenge to line up so many distinguished speakers. Time management is my most difficult challenge. And some of you may wonder why this global risk landscape is relevant to our discussion today. So I will show you the next slide, which will show why Sustainable Development Goals is designed to address 17 goals. As he said, global risk stems from not addressing root causes. And Sustainable Development Goals is designed to mitigate that risk by addressing the root causes, starting from inequality, lack of decent jobs, climate change. And this is one of his earlier slides to show likelihood on the horizontal side, impact on the vertical side. And if you look at up far right, extreme weather, natural catastrophes are there, very likely and highly impactable. And these are the direct outcome of climate change. And weapons of mass destruction, goal 16, peace, justice, conflicts. So I will show the next slide, juxtapose Sustainable Development Goals on these risks. So you can see 17 goals are perfectly matching this global risk landscape. And the next slide shows Sustainable Development Goals, the likelihood and impact. So from these slides, we can take some conclusions. First, Sustainable Development Goals implementation is necessary. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. Second, it is urgent. The more time passes, the more likelihood, the more impact we'll have. So cost of action now will be far less than the cost of inaction down the road. So that's why, as Mr. Moczarski emphasized in his last slide, prevention really matters. And this is my, my previous portfolio, disarmament. Maybe some of you may not know that a group of renowned atomic scientists set the doomsday clock at the beginning of every year. They started from 1947. And 2017, last year, it was set 2.5 minutes close to midnight. This is the worst since the Korean War. So this is worse than the even peak of the Cold War times. And this reflects the existential threat we are facing from weapons of mass destruction, including in particular nuclear weapons, but also climate change, and the likelihood and impact of technological developments on our lives. And this year, 2018, the clock moved to 2 minutes before the midnight. So we are very close to catastrophe. So unless we act now and together, we cannot address these problems. And I'd like to now invite